So to continue, like many of you, during the COVID-19 pandemics of 2020, my wife Trina and I spent our evenings at home rather than out enjoying restaurants, theater productions, and University of Wisconsin sporting events. So at one point, we fired up the DVD player and we binge watched 12 seasons of Bones, the TV series that ran from 2005 to 2017. How many people are familiar with Bones? Okay, quite a few of you. Well, then you know about the show's main character. She is a forensic anthropologist named Temperance Brennan, who is nicknamed Bones because her specialty is actually the human skeletal system. And Temperance is a quintessential humanist. She is the embodiment of reason, who brings the same critical eye to both her professional pursuits and her personal affairs. Brennan would undoubtedly second Albert Schweitzer's comment that, quote, all real progress in the world is in the last analysis produced by rationalism. But in her dismissal of emotionality, sentimentality, metaphysical faith, and even the maternal instinct, Brennan leads an intellectually engaging but otherwise rather unfulfilled life. And as the series progresses over those 12 years, Brennan's friends and her colleagues slowly but surely help her to find herself as a feeling and not just as a thinking being. Now, the series presents Temperance Brennan as a serious and very successful researcher, but at times her comments are extreme enough that she seems the parody of a humanistic scientist. But is she any less believable than a real-life character like, say, Richard Dawkins? Folks like this believe that humanism has been a positive animating force in the rise of Western civilization. And they insist that if a more general application of humanist principles were to take place, we all could look forward to a much brighter future. But then a growing chorus of voices demurs, they dissent, they disagree. They point to all the sprawling problems that now threaten to consume our planet. And these naysayers maintain that without significant modification, humanism may make a dystopian, if not an apocalyptic outcome more likely. Quite a contrast. Whose perspective is closer to the mark? So let me continue with a discussion surrounding a contemporary academic who has touted humanism as the indispensable philosophy for the 21st century and beyond. In his best-selling 2018 book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, Harvard professor Steven Pinker presents what is undoubtedly the most comprehensive and affirming brief on behalf of humanism that anybody has seen for decades. Anybody read Pinker's book? A couple of you have. It's a slog, but worth it. Pinker's definition is admirably succinct, if just perhaps a tad too broad. Humanism, he explains, may be defined as a package of values calculated to maximize human flourishing. And to the question whether it has actually achieved that purpose, Pinker's answer is an unqualified, resounding yes. And so he begins his encomium with the 18th century European Enlightenment, to which he assigns the credit for advancing 4 ideas that have shaped the modern world. These ideas being reason, science, progress, and humanism. That's what the book's about. And Steven Pinker esteems the Enlightenment because, as he then proceeds to document at some length, it has demonstrably worked and worked very well. Humankind has made progress on multiple fronts, despite protestations from the apostles of what he calls declinism. And so, in a rare burst of mixed literary illusions, Pinker describes declinists as, quote, hollow men eating their naked lunches in the wasteland while waiting for Godot. Now, for his part, Pinker serves up reams of statistical evidence demonstrating that the world has made spectacular progress in every single measure of human well being. It is, he says, the greatest story seldom told. Now, Pinker believes that too many of us have been negatively conditioned by news that overreports the world's problems and fails to highlight the many ways in which our lives have improved. None of us are as happy as we ought to be, given how amazing our world has become, he complains. And credit for all of this improvement belongs to society's growing commitment to these principles, reason, science, humanism, and its confidence that future progress is almost assured. Now, Pinker concedes that not everybody is always rational. And sometimes all of us succumb to cognitive and emotional biases that cloud our judgment. But on the whole, he says, in one realm after another, we are seeing the conquest of dogma and instinct by the armies of reason. Donald Trump aside. In discussing science, the fruits of which have become immeasurable, Pinker laments that scientific inquiry has too often been hindered not only by stubborn religious superstition and credulity, but by intellectuals in the humanistic disciplines who have yet, as he puts it, yet to recover from the disaster of postmodernism. Nevertheless, when all is said and done, reason and science have fully demonstrated their efficacy. And if adverse effects develop, well, it's probably due to a variety of factors and forces that simply have managed somehow to elude science and reason's authority. Now, Pinker's work is also unapologetically anthropocentric because it focuses exclusively on human needs and interests. Humanism does not preclude the flourishing of animals, he assures us, but our focus should be on the welfare of moi, humankind. Reason, science, and unshakable belief in progress, these are key elements of the humanist credo. But Pinker then also presents humanism as a much-needed moral alternative to theism. He describes the world's most religiously devout societies as hellholes. And he recommends as an antidote a realistic outlook governed by rational thought and focused on human fulfillment. As countries get smarter, he says, they turn away from God. This is a species of humanism that I like to call doctrinal humanism because it seems to hold that its claims are self-evident. Pinker's arguments basically repeat, however, what other humanists have been saying now for, well, almost a century, albeit he brings more data to bear on his own claims. Most notably, beginning in 1933, sympathizers began working together to create a series of humanist manifestos, of which there have been 4. The most recent was drafted in 2003. Now, although each of these documents differs somewhat, they consistently emphasize 5 points, which are in parallel with the ones that Pinker provides us with. The first point in doctrinal humanism: the evolutionary superiority of Homo sapiens, the centrality of human needs and interest, a position succinctly described as anthropocentrism. Second, a naturalistic outlook that finds no empirical basis for the existence of supernatural agents of any kind or for the revealed truths that they prefer. Third, the unique and unparalleled primacy of reason as a means for understanding the world and negotiating its terms. 4, the unrivaled capacity of science and technology to create and indefinitely maintain an advanced civilization. Fifth and finally, the promise of unlimited material and social progress under the suzerainty of reason, science, and technology. These then are what I believe to be the central tenets of contemporary doctrinal humanism. So just how much influence has this particular school of thought had on our culture? It is indeed true that most Americans still profess a belief in God, heaven and hell, the veracity of Holy Scripture, the efficacy of prayer, and so forth. The vast majority of Americans still subscribe to these traditional ideas. But then in the conduct of their daily lives, many of these same people have casually substituted reason for faith, material pursuits for piety and devotion, reliance on their own resourcefulness over the providential hand of God, and the prospect of material rewards here on earth instead of pie in the sky by and by. So clearly, we humans have mastered the art of holding two contrasting ideas in our heads at the same time without being terribly bothered about their inconsistency. It's a phenomenon known as compartmentalized thinking. Now, admittedly, only a small minority of Americans would opt for this label, humanist, over the vague term spiritual, as I am spiritual but not religious. But the philosopher John Gray maintains that in Immanuel Kant's time, the creed of conventional people was Christian, but now the conventional creed of people is humanist. And the best-selling historian Yuval Noah Harari agrees with that. He says the typical American today is simultaneously a nationalist, a free market capitalist, and a humanist from a practical, everyday point of view. Now, humanism's critics have responded with a variety of objections. Those with a religious outlook are bothered by humanism's secular orientation and its absolute repudiation of metaphysics. They don't like that. Others, however, take exception to what they feel is an overestimation of the powers of human reason, a cramped perspective on human progress, and an exceptional confidence in science and technology, and finally, an anthropocentric orientation that prioritizes human needs and interests over those of all other life forms. Those are some of the main objections that we hear. Taken together, these skeptics largely agree that in its present form, humanism is not up to the challenges that our species faces. So I've already mentioned the philosopher John Gray, who taught for many years at the University of London and has written many essays for the New York Review of Books. After the publication of Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, Gray dismissed his work as comic book history because it failed to honestly address many of the Enlightenment's glaring contradictions. And Gray also accuses Pinker of scientism because he presents science as a methodology capable of untangling all confusion and solving all problems. If we would only accept science's epistemological supremacy, Pinker believes that all of our ethical and political problems would simply disappear. But according to John Gray, there's simply no evidence to support that claim. It is a strange fallacy, he writes, a fallacy to suppose that science can bring reason to an irrational world when all it can really do is just give another twist to its madness. He rues the fact that Homo sapiens' moral and ethical development has lagged far behind its scientific and material gains. Ethics and morals have been sidelined in the ceaseless pursuit of wealth and power. Human knowledge increases, he says, but human irrationality remains much the same. John Gray. In recent times, environmentalists and life scientists have proven to be some of the fiercest critics of humanism's core beliefs. And for purposes of these remarks, I'm going to focus on just one, a woman by the name of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is the author of the 2013 book, Braiding Sweetgrass. A biologist, a distinguished professor, Kimmerer is an enrolled member of the Upper Midwestern Potawatomi tribe who also happens to recognize the limitations of her own scientific training. Now, she's very grateful that science has equipped her to see aspects of nature that remain largely hidden to the uninitiated. But at the same time, she agrees with another native scholar by the name of Greg Kahati. She agrees that of the four faculties that we use to apprehend the natural world, those being mind, body, emotion, and spirit, science privileges only the first of these, mind, and perhaps the second, body. And so she shares a story in her book that was related to her by a friend. It seems that a plant scientist had ventured into the South American rainforest, hoping to discover new and potentially useful botanical resources. He is accompanied by a young indigenous guide who eagerly points out certain plants that he thinks might arouse the botanist's interest. And the botanist, he's pleasantly surprised by this boy's familiarity with the forest's many species, and he also knows their formal scientific names. And so he compliments his achievement. Yes, the young man says with downcast eyes, I have learned the names of all the bushes, but I have yet to learn their songs. Kimmerer remarks that while scientific language aims for precision, it captures only a thin slice of reality. And thereby it misses much of what indigenous cultures understand and cherish about the land that they inhabit. Native people, she writes, they employ a language of animacy, which is also the language that toddlers of all races and all cultures use to describe their own encounters with the natural world, until, Kimmerer says, we teach them not to. Small children naturally perceive plants and animals as people, beings possessing qualities not unlike their own. But trained over time to regard a tree as an it rather than a thou, it thereby becomes much easier to take up the chainsaw and reduce it to just one more exploitable resource. Animacy is a quality that aspiring scientists are trained to ignore, if not to laugh at. Getting these professionals to consider the validity of indigenous knowledge is like swimming upstream in cold, cold water, Kimmerer says. And here, with that comment, she could be speaking directly to the celebrated humanist scientist E.O. Wilson. Prior to the advent of modern science, is there any knowledge worth preserving, he asks. Answering his own question, he insists that pre-scientific cultures were wrong, always wrong. Without exception, he says, they demonstrated a talent only for inventing ingenious speculations and myths. Now, for her part, Robin Wall Kimmerer never seriously doubts the value of her own scientific training. But she draws a crucial distinction between the practice of science and the scientific worldview which modern humanists such as E.O. Wilson subscribe to. Real science, Kimmerer says, brings the questioner into an unparalleled intimacy with a nature fraught with wonder as we try to comprehend the mysteries of the more than human world. That's what real science is about. But when this same science is commandeered and placed in the service of an all-knowing worldview, it ends up being used to reinforce a reductionistic, materialistic economic and political agenda. Ultimately, Kimmerer says, it separates knowledge from responsibility. And so she notes that in today's engineered industrial world held in thrall by the scientific worldview, nature becomes this Cartesian machine with human beings in the driver's seat. And this strikes indigenous people as arrogant. Among her own people, Kimmerer explains, Human beings are seen as the younger brothers and sisters of creation who are obliged to learn from their elders in the greater community of sovereign beings. But it takes a certain amount of humility to submit to the lessons that other sentient beings have to offer. And that humility is not a virtue one often finds among those who have thrown in their lot with the scientific worldview and doctrinal humanism. Well, this brief survey, and I'm only touching on just a couple of authors, wouldn't be complete without a foray into literature, and particularly dystopian literature, a genre in which anti-humanist sentiments are often clearly expressed. Almost without exception, these narratives describe a future world devastated by the unforeseen consequences of advanced technology. Well, there are many candidates here to choose from, and I share the stories of many of them in my book. There's C.S. Lewis, Ray Bradbury, Margaret Atwood, Cormac McCarthy. But I've chosen today to highlight Ursula K. Le Guin. In her novel, Always Coming Home, Le Guin envisions a post-apocalyptic civilization very, very different from our own. She sets the story in her native California, probably in a place like Napa Valley. But it is set so far in the future that people do not even recall how the great transformation took place or who might have been responsible for it. We find ourselves in the Valley of the Kesh, where the Keshites, the inhabitants, tell stories about this scary people long, long ago who had their heads on backwards. These dimly recalled terrifying figures were in reality the Kesh's distant ancestors, the people who were responsible for this near destruction of the planet. According to Kesh mythology, those who had done these things wrong had done them wrong mindfully. They had their heads on wrong. Lengthy sections of Le Guin's novel describe the rituals, the songs, the holidays, the myths, the social customs, the architectural and the transportation structures of this Kesh culture. And taken together, all of these ethnographic details add up to an intimate portrait of a society that has managed to reinvent itself following a global cataclysm. And she tries to imagine how humans might emerge from the ashes and create something much better. A comfortable, creative, spiritually nurturing, egalitarian culture in harmony with the natural environment. The Kesh are a people who have created a sustainable culture by going backwards, opting for a society rich in traditional values and low-tech solutions, rather than a society that prizes novelty and unrestrained technological innovation. Le Guin has stated elsewhere that Western civilization places too high a premium on reason, elevating it to a godhead. She says that the utopias conjured up by this Euclidean reason have now acquired a self-destructive capacity that demands a subversive response, which is what Always Coming Home is meant to achieve. So what's the upshot? My own feeling is that there are certainly aspects of humanism that we would do well to retain. While it is one thing to criticize the scientific worldview, it is quite another to downplay science's indispensable role in such matters as healthcare and increasingly in renewable energy. One lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is that too many people didn't take the science seriously enough. Or even worse, they were encouraged to dismiss the warnings and advice from medical experts and researchers as part of some kind of deep state conspiracy. Donald Trump's still doing that. Progress, on the other hand, this humanistic idea has become a vexed concept. And the singular focus of progress on technological advance and a standard of living measured almost exclusively in material terms, that's not worn very well. The internal combustion engine, a digitalized multiverse, toxic industrial agriculture, burgeoning arsenals of destructive weapons, all of these are wreaking havoc on a delicate environment, and on our own well-being as a species. These are problems. But fortunately, at least a few self-identifying humanists have in recent years raised serious doubts about all of this and about the positions that their doctrinal counterparts have staked out. And one of these new humanists is a guy named Anthony Pinn. He's an African-American professor of humanities at Rice University. Dr. Pinn's project is to replace this older humanism founded on Eurocentric European values, replace it with a more universal philosophy that takes into consideration the experience and the needs of marginalized peoples, non-Western peoples. In fact, Pinn's brand of humanism can truthfully be said to represent a kind of an anti-humanism in that it explicitly rejects much of the platform on which doctrinal humanism has always rested. Now, what Anthony Pinn and Steven Pinker's humanisms do have in common, what they agree on, is the unreality and the irrelevancy of supernatural entities that meddle in human affairs. That's out the window. But Pinn, for his part, does reserve a place in his humanism for religion, for religious language, for religious celebration, for theological speculation. All of these, he says, must play a role in people's lives. Because whether one is theistic or non-theistic, as he is in their thinking, there is this basic human need to render our lives meaningful. And some people do this by turning to divine agents that impinge themselves on the world, but we non-theists do it by relying on the abilities and the dreams of the human animal itself. Non-theistic humanism. Like its doctrinal counterpart, Pinn's humanism draws on the discoveries and the insights of science. And in particular, the concept of symmetry occupies a central place in his thinking. Symmetry, he says, is the one idea which man throughout the ages has tried to use to comprehend and create order and beauty and perfection. But at the same time, Pinn warns against vesting science with more authority than is warranted, because science is never free from the taint of socio-cultural commitments and biases. Lacking an element of self-critical awareness, scientism easily morphs into scientism, which becomes, he says, a faith of its own. And then Pinn's critique of the narrative of progress, so dear to Steven Pinker and many doctrinal humanists, his critique is also rather telling. He advocates for what he calls a measured realism in place of that one-directional linear version of history that emerged from the Enlightenment. Progress, he says, is by no means inevitable. It is just as likely that social transformations will produce misery as well as uplift. This, he says, is a different humanism, one made more worldly or world-worn, based on the ways in which advances in human knowledge and capacity have worked against the flourishing of life. So at the end of the day, I don't think the question really is, are you or are you not a humanist? It's rather, which humanism fits you the best? Blessed be, and amen. What's next?